Marshall here. Welcome back to the YouTube version of the Realignment podcast. My guest today is CNN's Chief National Security Analyst, Jim Sciutto. He's got a new book out. It's called The Return of Great Powers, Russia, China, and the Next World War. Obviously, that's a very provocative title, but I think in this conversation, Jim makes a pretty convincing case that we should understand how precarious our current geopolitical moment is through the lens of a possible global conflict. We have everything in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Russia, obviously the Indo-Pacific, and the Middle East. There are a bunch of bills that could come due over the next few years, and understanding how we can work to either deter or prevent a conflict like this is going to be absolutely key. I think another key point of this conversation is that we face a variety of huge choices when it comes to each of these conflicts separately, and obviously all of them together. So understanding the foreign policy and national security choices we have is key to moving forward. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Jim Sciutto, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. You're kind of kicking off a spate of books focused on great power competition. There are a bunch of these books coming out in the next few months. So I'm glad we can start here. I want to start with the actual title of the book because you make a very specific choice that folks who are dialed into these debates are probably going to take notice of. So the title is The Return of Great Powers, Russia, China, and the Next World War. Mm-hmm. Why did you choose to title it The Next World War and not The Next Cold War or not End the New Cold War? Why did you make the World War choice?
Because I think it is not a Cold War. I think it's hotter than that. It's not quite a hot war, but it has the ingredients for it. And while there are parallels to the last Cold War, there are a lot of differences that make it fundamentally more dangerous, in my view. One of which is that instead of having one great power adversary for the U.S. and its allies in Russia, you have two, Russia and China, and those two joining hands. I talk a lot in the book about how they announced this no limits partnership, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin did just weeks before the Ukraine invasion. So that's one piece that is different. We also are in a time when a lot of the treaties, means of communication, the hotlines, and so on, they either don't exist or they don't exist anymore, never existed or don't exist anymore, ways that we had developed in the last Cold War to avoid open conflict. They're just not there. And we have whole new categories of weapons where there's already a kind of simmering conflict underway. Cyber weapons, regular attacks back and forth, the weaponization of space, and a decline of nuclear treaties with Russia and no nuclear treaties with China, which is rapidly ramping up its nuclear arsenal. I'm certainly not rooting for a hot war for the next World War. And I don't think it's inevitable. But I do think the ingredients are there and that we have to recognize those ingredients and then find paths to peace. The last chapter of the book is called Paths to Peace. So in which I poll smarter people than myself, leaders around the world, diplomats, and so on, for ways to avoid it becoming the next World War. But I do think it's fundamentally different from a Cold War.
That's really interesting because I like the way you answered that because immediately I started thinking about how, well, in the 80s during the Cold War, we armed the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. But at a key point, though, to your point about how Russia and China are very intertwined, China was aligned towards us during that period. So it's even within the metaphor of us thinking about previous eras where we've used U.S. military and intelligence support with a quasi-proxy situation, even that's going to differ a lot from the current situation we're in now. So let's take another step back. And in your previous podcast appearances and in the book itself, you talk about how we are living in a 1939 moment. I'd like you to really expand and articulate why you think that's true.
So I've been writing for some time and reporting on the deteriorating relationships between the U.S., Russia, and China. I wrote a book in 2019 called The Shadow War. The thesis of that was that there was already a low-level conflict, China and Russia seeking to undermine the U.S. and its allies, but below the threshold of an open war, of a hot war, a shooting war. In February 2022, I found myself in Ukraine as the Russian invasion began. And as I saw those cruise missiles falling on Ukrainian cities and the tanks rolling across the border, with Russia beginning the largest war we've seen since World War II, the bloodiest, that was a clean break with that past. If things had been deteriorating, sliding towards this return of great power conflict, that was the clean break. A state, a great power adversary decided that it could use military force, in fact, the bulk of its conventional military forces, to slice off a giant piece of Europe, not a tiny sliver, right, but the largest country in Europe by force of arms. And that struck me as fundamentally different, and with a lot of parallels to 1939. Hitler did the same with the Sudetenland, with Poland. And there were, very similarly at the time, those who said, let's just give it to him. Let's not start another war, the Neville Chamberlains of the world, and that it all will be fine and he'll be satisfied. Putin, like Hitler, shows no evidence of being satisfied with each land grab as he attempts to rebuild the old Soviet Union. He takes one, and then he says, okay, what can I take next? I speak at great length with the Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, who's right on the front lines of this conflict. And she quotes frequently Winston Churchill about Hitler, the crocodile, that an appeaser is someone who feeds the crocodile expecting that he or she will be its last meal. And she sees parallels between Hitler and Putin. The make a deal camp imagines that if you just cede this piece of Ukraine or that piece of Georgia or that piece of Moldova or this next bigger piece of Ukraine, all will be fine and we can go back to where we were. But the fact is, I don't believe that's true. And the folks I spoke to for this book around the world, Europe, Asia, they don't believe that's true. And there's a direct connection between the fate of Ukraine with the fate of Taiwan as well, because China might very well make that crocodile's choice, right? If Ukraine were to fall and say, you know what, maybe I can get away with taking Taiwan.
I don't mean to quibble, but I want to be precise about something you said. You said this was the biggest war since World War II. We're obviously meaning in the context of Europe.
Yes.
There were obviously, the Vietnam War was bigger. No the various wars, civil wars in post-colonial Africa, especially, and Central Africa were bigger. But I think at a key point, if we're understanding why the U.S. succeeded in the Cold War, I'd say the way of measuring our success was twice in 2 generations. We had to send millions of American soldiers, Marines, et cetera. There weren't airmen at the time, but over to fight over those conflicts. And the fact that that didn't happen from 45 to 1991 is a real achievement. So the fact that you're seeing another one of those wars that brings in obviously American assets and then makes us ask questions about our status of forces, our commitments, that's what the real post-Cold War disaster is.
And listen, and to be clear, I was certainly talking about the largest war in Europe since World War II, and don't mean to forget the lessons of Vietnam. And it's interesting because folks have asked me, is this a new domino theory in effect, which of course was used to justify the Vietnam War. Now, when you look back at history, the domino theory didn't hold in Vietnam because there was a fundamental U.S. reading of what that war was about, right? We looked at it as, well, this is really a Soviet thing that they're looking to grab a piece of Asia, when in reality it was a civil war. And when you look at the historical record, it wasn't really their fight. I would argue that this one very much is Russia's fight, but it is Russian forces, right, that have come across the border. And as we try to assess what Putin's view is of it, just listen to what he says, right? Listen to how he talks about how Ukraine never existed as a country. And then how he talks about his next targets. He says very similar things about the Baltic states, that they should never have been independent. And by the way, if you look at history, for centuries, they've been part of, right? He manufactures the history to his own convenience. And that's why I believe that, and again, I don't use the domino theory mantra for this book, but that this one is more substantively, these conflicts more substantively tied to the great power conflict than wars of the past that we misread. I think the historical record has shown.
When I think that in the actual issue with Vietnam is it's not just, to your point, the U.S. foreign policy establishment misinterpreting a post-colonial civil war as being a part of a broader geopolitical world situation. It's actually that was offensive in our sense, as in the point was, okay, so we see this conflict, we're going to deploy millions and millions of American troops in order to affect one side of the war here. At a key point, though, we have said from the start, we are not deploying American troops in Ukraine. And secondly, when we're talking about the implications for Poland, for the Baltic countries, we're speaking in purely defensive manners. We are not saying, okay, there's this domino theory. Let's rush in and reach for Moscow by winter. We are just saying, hey, let's maintain our alliances. Let's backstop our production. Let's make sure our supply chains are ready. And I just feel that so many times on the kind of quasi-isolationist side, that issue is missed in terms of how we're actually determining our response to the strong possibility that this could extend beyond Ukraine.
It's a great point. The other piece is that listen to our allies on this, right? When the Polish leaders and the Estonian leaders and Lithuanians and others speak about the Russia threat in very stark terms, and they say we're Russia's next targets, we should listen to them because they're not basing this on imagination, right? They have a real world, personal, direct experience of living under the Russian yoke only a generation ago, not decades ago. Estonia got its independence in 1991, right? I was in college. The Warsaw Pact only dissolved, in the early 1990s. So the Polands of the world, they know what it's like to live under Russia, and they're saying we don't want that again. So I think. Again, it's not a policy that developed independently in the think tanks of Washington, right? This is something that is developed from the actual choices of people in Eastern Europe. Or look at the Ukrainians. Russia has been meddling in Ukraine going back to 2000, long time, but back to the 2004 election when there was a candidate there. You may remember Viktor Yushchenko. They didn't like him. He was leaning too far towards Western Europe, which Ukrainian voters, by the way, wanted him to do, and they poisoned him. That was the upset in Russia. It was not that it was a U.S. coup or anything like that. It was because they saw Ukraine making a choice to move away from Russia, and they would not allow that. And 18 years later, they decide to invade.
Let's talk about Europe, because the area where I am most sympathetic to critics of the Biden administration's approach is basically this idea that if this is so existential as you and I are agreeing about, if the stakes are so high, why are the Western Europeans dragging their feet in ways that don't seem consistent with the rhetorical stakes? Now, you set out clearly the Baltic countries, the former Soviet bloc members, Ukraine, Poland, et cetera, they are clearly acting in accord with all of the rhetoric and the actual policy we're putting together here. But it seems as if part of the difficult position we find ourselves in is we're having to defend Europe as a whole. Just rhetorically and politically. Yet there's Eastern Europe, there's Central Europe, and there's Western Europe. Yeah. I'd love you just to articulate from your reporting and your personal experience how we should understand these combined dynamics.
There's definitely a difference in point of view as you move from east to west in Europe. It's not uniform, but there's a difference. The Eastern-facing partners, based on their history and their proximity to the Russian threat, they are the most concerned. Kaja Kallas, Estonian Prime Minister, says in no uncertain terms, we will be next if Ukraine were to fall. The Polish leaders say similar. And oftentimes, and a good deal of this is in the book, Kaja Kallas will talk about how when she speaks to some of her Western NATO, the leaders of Western NATO allies, she says they're just not, they're like, maybe it's going to be okay. And she's like, no, it's not going to be okay. She has to kind of rattle their cages a bit. It's not uniform, right? Because if you look at the UK, the furthest European NATO ally from Russia, they have been very forthright from the beginning in terms of weapon supplies and how they see this threat. And you've also seen a shift over time. At the start of the war, Germany's foreign policy was engagement with Russia through years of Angela Merkel's leadership and economic dependency, energy dependency on Russia. They have broken both of those policies, economic policy and foreign policy. Macron, he was talking to Putin days before the Ukraine invasion, saying, there's a way out of this. They're not that serious. We could find a way. You listen to Macron's words today, he's much more forthright about the Russia threat. So there's been some shift, but it's not the same. And some of that you see in their defense investments, right? Estonia, well above 3%. Some of those Central European, Western European countries, well, do we really need to right now? They've certainly required more prodding, over time.
Something I'm curious about, because there's actually two different arguments that those Western Europeans should be thinking about. So there is just the basic Russia threat, Ukraine needs to win argument, which is the one that the Biden administration and other Western allies have been advancing. But the other deeper argument is there's entirely a world, it seems like we're in a coin flip election scenario, where a empowered Donald Trump fundamentally shifts the United States away from Europe. And if you know anything about defense production and all of these like defense policy issues, you can't just wake up one day in 2026 after the US is out of NATO and say, okay, we're going to start ramping up our defense production. We're going to start making sure our supply chains are secure, that our energy policies are set. You actually have to start moving now. So that's the person that concerns me the most. It seems to me that like it's one thing for me as an American to bemoan a Trump who could remove us from NATO. On the other hand, it sort of feels like you're tearing your hair out saying, no, do you not understand how serious this is? Yeah. And that's entirely different, as I said, from the debate about, well, can the Russians be held? What we're really describing here is the United States that could entirely shift its post-war positioning towards Europe. So I'd love to hear how you're seeing that reality play out.
It's a great point. I have a chapter on this in the book called The Trump Wildcard. Whatever your politics, this election, American voters have a choice on how the U.S. interacts with the world. And it's a stark choice. Biden, called a globalist, but, committed to those alliances, calling Russia and China out for what they are, and North Korea and Iran, and not claiming, as Trump and many of his supporters do, that, well, we can work with this guy and I know how to handle them. Whoever wins in November, you either stay the course on what is a decades-old bipartisan U.S. approach to adversaries and allies, or you do a 180. A significant 180 under Donald Trump. And for that, it's not just me or you talking. I speak to Trump's former senior advisors, his former chief of staff, General John Kelly, his former national security advisor, John Bolton, his former deputy national security advisor, Matthew Pottinger, involved in his Asia policy. And they say in a second Trump term, he will leave NATO, or at least attempt to. Congress has passed some legislation that requires congressional approval. But the fact is, as commander-in-chief, if he says, I am not going to send troops to Estonia to defend it from Russia, then Article 5 of NATO means nothing. He has, they say, very little interest in the U.S. defense agreement with South Korea. He even talked in his first administration about taking troops off the peninsula. Not a lot of interest in defending Japan. And with regards to Taiwan, I have a story in the book that Bolton tells of Trump in the Oval Office, that when he was president, he would sit at the desk and take out a Sharpie and point to the tip of the Sharpie and say, see this? That's Taiwan. And then point to his desk and say, that's China, to make the point that Taiwan has no chance against China, and therefore we have no business defending them. Those are not nuances or minor shifts on U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy, how it deals with the world. Those are major shifts, a reversal, and not just from Biden, but from presidents going back, to FDR. That's a choice. And the results in November are going to determine that, not just for the U.S., but for our partners in Europe, partners in Asia.
Do you see the Europeans, especially in the West, internalizing this excellent political reality you just described?
I ask them all the time. And I was like, guys, this is a real possibility. Now, if I ask them in public forums, they'll say, well, America's been along. We have confidence in the American system, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to comment on politics. If you ask them in private, they know that this is a major choice. And they are, let's be frank, they are rooting against it very much because it enormously affects their security. You've heard some public comments from European leaders, Macron among them, saying we have to do more on our own now. We can't rely on the U.S. as much. And it's true, right? I mean, that's not a judgment. If you have a potential U.S. president who says things like Russia, do whatever the hell you want to NATO allies if they don't pay up, you got to take that to heart. And you got to make plans for your own national security. So they know it. It's interesting. I talked to the Canadian foreign minister in the book too, and she talks about this phenomenon of Trump proofing. some agreements and plans and so on. I mean, you can only do so much because the U.S. is such a dominant player in NATO. Our military is the biggest in the world. There are things that only we can do, but they've tried to lock in some agreements beyond the election to provide some continuity. The trouble is, we're the bear, right? We're the bear in this conflict, and if you have a president who takes us out of it or believes he could make accommodations with Putin or Xi or Kim, that has enormous effect.
Speaking of Taiwan, something I'm really curious about, I think this is something that folks should be increasingly focused on, is if I'm in Taiwan, my number one concern would be, how do I prevent what happened with Ukraine from happening to us? And I don't mean in the sense of, obviously, like geopolitically, militarily, they don't want to have a Chinese invasion happen. But what I'm really talking about is the political reality within Washington. The war in Ukraine starts. There's a very clear consensus on a bipartisan level that, okay, we should defend Ukraine. We should pass these aid packages. Like, there's a consensus. And then what you have happen over the course of basically 2 years is slowly, the more isolationist parts of the right, or let's say the more America First parts of the right, so they would describe themselves, start gaining more influence in the debate. The political dynamics start shifting a bit. It seems clear to me that pretty quickly in 2025, let's say there's any type of Taiwan conflict, you would see that similar scenario replicate itself in a bunch of ways. Yeah. I'm curious how you, looking at both the foreign policy, but also the political dynamics of this issue, would see what should the Taiwanese learn from the Ukraine experience in terms of the bipartisan consensus falling apart.
It's interesting. When I came back from Ukraine in spring of 2022, after covering the start of the invasion, it struck me that I got plaudits from the left and the right, from Democratic and Republican congressmen. Boy, CNN, you brought such powerful stories from there. It was, and folks in the street, right? They were watching that coverage. They felt that Ukraine was wronged. This shall not stand, right? And that was the public commentary at the time from left and right, bipartisan support for Ukraine. It has changed today. Now, there are still majorities in Congress that support aid for Ukraine. The big changes are, one, Donald Trump. He does not. And they don't want to get on the wrong side of Donald Trump. So that's one change. The other is just a kind of general, and I've seen this in so many wars, even our own wars, American short attention span, right? That in the early days of the war, they were on it. Now it's lasted a little long. Why isn't it over yet? And do we really care that much? And the images of dead Ukrainian civilians, you see them less often, so it's easier to put a distance between yourself and them. Listen, we ran out of interest in our own wars, right? When you look in Iraq and Afghanistan. I certainly experienced that as a reporter covering those wars, that in the early days, we didn't stop talking about it. Then after a couple of years, you couldn't get on the news anymore. So I think, one part of that trend is just the nature of how we operate, right? We're short attention span. We're a short attention span country, but the other piece is political, and his name is Donald Trump. He does not want to help Ukraine, and a lot of lawmakers, even ones, Republicans who know the U.S. should, fear their own political lives, and don't want to get on the wrong side of him. And I think you could see similar with Taiwan. If Trump believes the U.S. shouldn't be involved, you'll see his party line up, as we've seen on so many things. So how does Taiwan manage that? I don't know. The difficulty on Taiwan, right, is that at least this president, Biden, has committed the U.S. to a military response. I talk about this in the book. 4 times he has said in public, we will defend Taiwan militarily, which no U.S. president has ever said before. We had strategic ambiguity, sort of I don't know, maybe we will, maybe we won't, China, but, just you make your own bet on that, and maybe we show up, right? And now he's committed the U.S., and that's fundamentally different, right? Because that means U.S. lives, service members' lives at risk, which is another debate we should have, right? Should the U.S. go to war and lose potentially many thousands of service members, which all the war games show about Taiwan? But I think some of those dynamics are likely to be consistent.
I'm curious what you think about this, just as observing this as a, political national security analyst. My reaction has been a key mistake that was made. And saying the word mistake is complicated because there's always different actors and institutions and players. it made a lot of sense at the start of Russia's invasion to so personalize Ukraine around President Zelensky. Once again, he stays in Kyiv for the first 3 days. Look at, by contrast, the president of Afghanistan fleeing with like gold in his suitcase. Famously, he was an exchange student at my high school. So, the worst ever Lake Oswego High School graduate. So within 6 months, seeing the worst case of the U.S. ally fleeing versus a U.S. ally staying, obviously personalizing that story really matters. And also, once again, we're coming out of a world where so many Americans have a deep personal relationship, or at least historical relationship, to Winston Churchill's leadership in World War II. It made so much sense in those first 3 months to focus on that aspect of it. But I feel as we got further and further out, we just quickly saw that the personality-based reality of that relationship made it so it became so easy for this to become a partisan scuffle between individual political actors and Zelensky himself, instead of making it kind of about Ukraine broadly. So my kind of thought here is, if I'm Taiwan, I want this to be about Taiwan. I want this to be about the Taiwanese people. Making this about the specific relationships that the president of Taiwan has, or that the leader of the Taiwanese military has with specific American political actors, would probably be inadvisable in this partisan environment. But I'm curious what you'd think about that, Reed.
I think it's a good point. I mean, you want to nationalize it as much as possible, because people can be, as we've seen with Zelensky, they could be tarred, right? I mean, the right has tarred Zelensky often based on nothing. He's corrupt, he's doing it for the money. Here's a guy who is, under threat. Russia just dropped a cruise missile on Odessa while he was there with the Greek prime minister, a few hundred yards from where he was standing. So this is a guy genuinely risking his life to help defend his country. It strikes me that there is historical parallels for this. If you go back to World War II, right? Churchill is a hero today. FDR is a hero today. But at the time in America, there were divisions over how FDR was seen. It's interesting, the America First camp in 1939, 1940, they said a lot of the things about the war that we now say about a war like Ukraine. It's too far away. They're not really our people. And by the way, Pearl Harbor was a conspiracy to get us in that war. People accused FDR of that from the right at the time. So there's historical basis for these kinds of things. So what does Taiwan do to avoid that fate? It's hard to say. I mean, I think, we've seen a lot of accounts of Ukrainian civilians suffering, and that moved people, Americans, for a time. It's fading over time. There's less coverage of it, and people just get bored, right? Taiwan has an added factor, which is it is central to the world, the modern technology, high technology economy. More than 80% of chips are manufactured there. And you hear some communication of that from Biden administration officials and others to say that if China gets this, we're screwed, right? Because literally everything, your phones, your car, nothing survives. Our weapon systems, nothing survives without those chips. And if China controls that, we're in trouble. That gives a slightly better argument. Maybe it moves people. I don't know, because I think that oftentimes the American public doesn't react until they see the costs of something, as opposed to talking about the costs of something. And again, there's a lot of historical precedent for that, right? World War II was a distant war until the bombs started dropping on Pearl Harbor, and it affected us. We haven't had that with this war yet. And, with Taiwan, you would probably feel those effects. But right now, that seems like a distant possibility, and we're not great at looking into the future.
Hey, it's Marshall. In an exponential era, it's more important than ever for our country to have alignment between policymakers, founders, and funders. However, it's rare that we find all of them in the same room. Luckily, the A16Z podcast from Andreessen Horowitz just dropped a brand new series on American dynamism focused on exactly this. Coined by Realignment friend and A16Z general partner Catherine Boyle, American dynamism is a movement that embodies the spirit of innovation, and this new 4-part series, recorded in the heart of Washington, D.C., covers topics including intelligence in the era of AI, the nuclear renaissance, and the future of defense. Guests include the CIA's first ever Chief Technology Officer, Nand Mulchandani, the Department of Energy's Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy, Dr. Catherine Huff, and Director of the DoD's Defense Innovation Unit, Doug Beck. not to mention the founders of ambitious companies rivaling the status quo like microreactor company Radiant, AI pilot company Sciutto AI, and advanced autonomous systems company Anduril. So don't miss out. Go check out the A16Z podcast and their new series on American dynamism on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now. I'd love to hear you talk about the rationale for American engagement with a Taiwan crisis, because I really, as a person who's pro-Taiwan, I really don't like how centered the semiconductor chips conversation has been in terms of why we need to defend Taiwan and do things, because, very quickly, and I survey the American right, like that's my intellectual background, very quickly, what the isolationist right will say to people who make the semiconductor case is no blood for semiconductors. They're going to appropriate the no blood for oil talk from the 2000s. I don't have children, but you've talked about you have you have teenage boys, like they're not on the field now, but they would be almost of certain draft age during a probable conflict. I don't see a world where, as a father, you wake up in the morning and you say, like, man, I love my 2024 Ford, but if we can't get that 2026 Ford because the chips aren't ready, fine, it's just not a convincing case. And I think the better case is more just the fact that we like the status quo. We like how great powers no longer invade other powers to take territory and start wars and actually get dominoes collapsing. We don't like seeing trade disrupted. And what the American policy in Taiwan and the Asia Pacific is aimed around is just maintaining the peaceful status quo. And any actor, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, Hamas, who's launching an offensive war is actually disrupting that status quo. And that's what we're really defending against. We're trying to deter a conflict from happening. And I think that's just so much of a better consensus articulation than just overdoing it on chips. Because we just wouldn't do that. It doesn't make any sense if you actually think about the electoral coalitions and the actual spate of scenarios here.
I hear you. Listen, me personally, I'm an old school idealist, right? It matters to me that the Ukrainian people are good people and they're getting bombed and killed and raped by Russia. They want to have sovereignty in their own country, and they want to move closer to Europe, and Russia is not allowing that and is willing to murder, right, to prevent that. That upsets me as an individual, as an American. And I feel the same about Taiwan. I went to Taiwan researching this book. In fact, I brought both of my boys because they're interested in Asia. They're both studying Chinese. Taiwan is a vibrant country. It is a beautiful country. It's an innovative country, and it's a country. I say country. China won't allow that. It's a state that wants to be. Does not want to be. An outpost of the CCP. They don't, and I fundamentally support that as an individual. I suppose the question is, when you're making decisions as a nation to go to war potentially, you have to justify that on a number of fronts. I think the values case is an important one, and I agree with you that it goes far beyond chips. And this is how I try to articulate this to people, that you may think that this is a distant war, whether it be Ukraine or Taiwan, that doesn't affect you or me. But the fact is, we have all benefited from the rules-based international order, which sounds wonky, but is a real thing. We've all benefited from that, and from a core piece of that is that borders matter, and that you cannot redraw maps based purely on force, and you cannot kill your political opponents wherever they are in the world, and you cannot pressure businesses, as China does, if they're on the wrong side of a deal with a state-owned enterprise, right? That we allow open trade and open travel of goods through the Asian shipping lanes or through Europe. That benefits us in superficial ways. Things are cheaper. You can do trade around the world, but also we can travel to these places. When I was a kid, you couldn't go to Eastern Europe, right? Our kids can study there now. You can open a business there now. You can have a branch of your office there. Without that affects our lives in many ways, which is not just a values case, but it's a self-interest case. And I would argue that if you grant the ground to the crocodile, right, he will want more, and eventually he's going to bite your allies, and eventually he'll bite you. I think all that together is part of the case. So I agree, we shouldn't make it fundamentally a self-interested. If you want your EV and the chips in the EV case, we have to go broader than that. But some people are moved by some things and some by other things. And I suppose you just have to make as broad a case as possible.
Something I'd love to talk about with you is, let's talk about the words we use to describe the various people on this debate. Because, earlier in the episode, like I said the word isolationist, I've made reference to the word appeaser, like you've brought up these terms. And when we use them, I cringe because these terms have real resonant meanings within like American political history and the real context that it's being used. So when we use the term appeaser, we're not just describing someone with like quasi like Nazi sympathies, of which there were people in the British American establishment during the 1930s, but we're also describing people who make a fundamental error of misreading of misreading Hitler, of misreading the Japanese, of misreading Mussolini. Today, though, there are so many different individual decisions we have to make that I worry if I smear people who disagree with me as isolationist or appeasing, it actually cuts away at some of the broader nuance. So, for example, you talk about this in the book, but once again, I'm doing this as an armchair analyst podcaster, so I'm saying that with like awareness. I became incredibly concerned leading into the second Ukrainian counteroffensive that there was just too much weight placed in the success of that counteroffensive in a way that just wasn't politically sustainable. I remember, David Ignatius of the Washington Post, he's coming on in a few months to talk about his book. So I hope he's not listening right now. David Ignatius had a Washington Post editorial where he said that this counteroffensive is Ukraine's D-Day. And my reaction was that is a disastrous political articulation of what's going on there, because once again, this is why history and these terms matter. If you say D-Day is what's at stake there, the American public is going to have a very specific expectation of what the result is going to be. Obviously, like in actual D-Day, they spend all the way into July fighting in hedgerows, and it's horrible and it's horrible and horrible. And you can imagine, the Germans throwing them back into the sea. But the point is, by September, you're moving into Antwerp and hopefully we're going to reach Germany by, Christmas. That didn't happen. So by setting things up within that D-Day language, by using that World War II imagery, it's not a shocker that after the counteroffensive fails for a variety of complicated reasons, you're going to see a real plummeting in excitement, in interest, and you're going to say, people start to say, hey, like, I'm not an appeaser, but like, man, y'all need to switch to a defensive state. Maybe you need to sue for peace. So I threw a lot of things at you, but I'm just curious how you think about these dynamics and these terms.
Well, I'm going to get to the terms in a moment because I agree with you, and there's such hot button terms we need to tread carefully. Just briefly on the counteroffensive, I agree. It's interesting. The Munich Security Conference, kind of the military Davos, right, just happened. And if you compare the feeling at this year's versus last year's, there was so much confidence about Ukraine, and the primary fear, and this was before the counteroffensive, but all the buildup to it, and the fear then was, well, Russia can't lose too badly, because that would be catastrophic, and things might collapse, and we got to kind of look for an off-ramp for Russia here. This year, it's flipped to the other side. Is like, oh my gosh, Ukraine could lose. The truth is probably somewhere in between, right? I think the risks for Ukraine are severe right now, but Russia is not totally recovered. It's got its own weaknesses, but that flip, that 180-degree turn, is notable given all the buildup to the counteroffensive. On the terms, I hear you. And I think that, I think about that with the 1939 comparison or even Hitler comparisons to Putin. No, Putin has not led the Holocaust, but he certainly has shown no reluctance to kill civilians wholesale in Ukraine and for soldiers to rape and pillage and that kind of thing. But he hasn't done that. But, the parallel to Hitler is that he is redrawing the borders by force, and not just once, multiple times. Georgia 2008, Ukraine 2014, again 2022, all that he's trying now with Transnistria and Moldova. He's doing it in ways big and small. And that, I'll make the case why 1939 fits that. And I'll make the case why the Hitler comparisons on aggression fit that. And I think you can make the case why some folks are appeasers. Donald Trump is willing to sacrifice Ukraine. That to me is an appeasement position. Now, folks who are skeptical of going to war or worried about escalation with Russia in Ukraine or worried about a direct war with China, I share those concerns, frankly. It's like you said, I don't want my sons to die on a carrier in the Taiwan Strait in 3 or 4 years' time. I don't. and that kind of war would be devastating for all sides involved. But I feel like in that category, you're trying to have a reasonable substantive debate about costs and benefits. Yes, there are costs and risks to standing up with firmness and with the threat, frankly, of military action. And there are costs to not doing that as well, right? And we have to debate and have a public debate about it, an honest one. John Kelly talks in the book. Here's a guy, a retired Marine general, decades of military service going back to the Vietnam War, who lost his son in Afghanistan. He is a Gold Star father who says in the book, he says, listen, I don't think we've had a conversation with the American public about war over Taiwan. And we should, because you could see thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of American service members die. Is the American public ready for that? Is that a price they're willing to pay? You have to ask them, right? Because it would be their sons and daughters dying. That's a fair debate to have. But when you have the folks like Tucker Carlson going to a single Moscow supermarket and somehow saying it's better than here, that's just ignorant, right? That's ignorant. That is ignoring how Russia treats its own people and people outside its borders. And on those positions, I'll go head to head, right? And I will call them appeasers on that. To the other folks, I say, listen, let's have a debate and let's see. And I personally worked out, whether the military, whether it is justified as an American to go to war of Taiwan. I don't know. It's I support the people, but that's a lot to ask of the American public.
Yeah, and I really like what you just said there, and I want to call this out about 1939 as the metaphor, because obviously, and you see this on the kind of new right or like the neo-isolationist right or the America First right, they invoke the references to Munich and Hitler and say, well, look, when LeMay is haranguing Kennedy about not intervening in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's bringing up Munich. So they're rightfully saying, look, this has been weaponized to near disaster before. Let's avoid that. And I agree. I think there's something very true and very wise in that warning. But what I focus around, my focus on Munich and my focus on the Sudetenland and the Anschluss with Austria and Ethiopia, all those 1930s conflicts, is there are questions that are raised by the U.S. and Western and League of Nations response to those crises. And it's useful to place our situation in the lens of those questions. So the question raised by Munich is, what do we do if we misread the dictator we're making a deal with? Like, that's what it's not that Putin's Hitler. He doesn't have to be running the Holocaust. What if we make a deal with him and leave NATO because it doesn't really matter? And then he goes into Poland.
Yeah.
That actually really matters. Okay, what if we leave, he goes into Poland, and then all of a sudden Western Europe is filled with nukes because they have no confidence in the U.S. in the U.S.-led security order where we offer the nuclear umbrella. Those are questions that are raised by Munich that don't require anyone making the case that Putin is Hitler or that Xi Jinping is Hitler. I just think it's so important to refocus around their interesting and relevant historical questions. And once again, the reason why Kennedy is correct in rejecting LeMay's weaponization of, his father, Joseph P. Kennedy's bad performance at Munich and in that appeasement era is that actually doesn't meet the Munich test. Cuba doesn't meet the Munich test. There are a variety of ways we could accomplish the goal, aka non-offensive nuclear weapons there, that didn't require launching airstrikes. So I think that's just so key. So here's the question for you. What are some questions that are raised by this 1939 period that you think policymakers should be, and the American people should be thinking about?
Well, it's a basic question, right? Some wars are worth fighting and some are not. Right. That's a basic question. And some are Munich-like moments and some are not. I mean, Saddam Hussein was called Hitler. He's a bad guy, but he didn't have thousands of nuclear warheads as does Vladimir Putin. So these are qualitative judgments we have to make along the way. And we've made some good calls and some bad calls in our recent and distant American history. I talk about 1962 in the book and the Cuban Missile Crisis and how JFK had every member of his cabinet read The Guns of August, the Barbara Tuchman book that had come out earlier in 1962, which is all about momentum towards war, how entangling alliances and misreadings and so on can lead you to a conflict that nobody wanted going in. And there's a great quote in the book. JFK at the time said, here's The Guns of August. I don't want anybody to write a book called The Missiles of 1962. He didn't want to be, the guy who started a world war. And they found a way out. And by the way, they found a way out and instituted some guardrails to prevent that from happening again, treaties and hotlines and so on, many of which have disappeared now, which again, as we were talking earlier, put us in danger again of a conflict. I mean, the thing is, this is the debate, and some comparisons to that moment will be fair and some will not be. I just think, as I do in the book, you can make a very strong case that this is a 1939 moment in a way that Cuba was not, or even Iraq was not, more recently. These are hard decisions to make. It's Kaja Kallas, again, I keep talking about her because I just find the Estonians fascinating because they're right on the front lines, right? And they make these warnings about Russia based on their own personal and recent experience of living under Russia's yoke. They don't make it based on imagination. And she's reading books all the time. She was telling me the list of histories and biographies she's been reading of Churchill, of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of Russia, of Putin, because she wants to be informed by history as she makes decisions today for her own country. She doesn't want a war either, right? She wants to avoid a war, but she also wants to avoid being absorbed by Russia, which is a cost she's not willing to pay, right? Understandably so. Are we willing to sacrifice the Estonians to Russia because we just don't want to get involved this time? I'm not personally, and I think we could make a very good case, as you mentioned, what that would mean for Europe going forward. I mean, these are hard questions for leaders. They're not easy ones. And they're also ones that the American public needs to be involved in because they will be part of the solution, right? Or they'd be part of the conflict.
So for the last section here, I'd love to hear from you the moving forward part, speaking to the last chapter of the book, because hearing everything you're articulating, thinking about these topics deeply, I could say the fair consensus between our views are, okay, we don't want either ourselves or our children to have to fight a war in the Indo-Pacific. We don't want the war in Ukraine to escalate beyond Ukraine. We obviously want the Ukrainians to take the maximum amount of their territory back that they can. But at a core level, I think deterrence is just the way to understand this moment. If we're in a pre-war era, another way that 1939 is a useful metaphor is, okay, the Allies failed to deter Hitler. Hitler did not believe that the British would actually declare war over Poland. Hitler should be understood as a gambler who just gambled. Okay, I'm going to break the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, I'm going to intervene in the Spanish Civil War. Okay, I'm going to connect Germany with Austria, Sudetenland, taking all of Czechoslovakia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he finally just gambled too far. So obviously, he's a murderous, evil dictator. That's on him by definition. But you could imagine a better world where the British and the French better signaled, no, seriously, we have drawn a hard line here. Same thing is true of 2021 in Ukraine. It's hard to imagine a world where the Russians would have invaded the way they invaded, knowing the Western response that they actually received, knowing the seriousness of the Ukrainian people. I know obviously that was a mix because they didn't believe it was a real state, so they decided it would really collapse. But what would you say the lessons for deterrence are moving forward? Because my theory of the case of how we avoid the next world war is by deterring those great autocratic powers who are on the offensive from doing it in the first place.
Yeah, it's a great point because you look back to World War II. It's not like it was a big kumbaya moment and people recognized Hitler for what he was right away. There was a lot of ceding of ground, right? And same with Japan prior to World Harbor. I mean, they were hoovering up large parts of Asia before they struck Hawaii, and arguably we should have seen it before. And same with Putin. You look at the Europe's and America's, frankly, reaction to the 2014 partial invasion of Ukraine, which was limp, right? And you can understand why Putin might calculate, are they really going to get in the way if I take more or take all of it? You could even connect that to the Afghanistan withdrawal, which I don't think is an unreasonable point along the way. If the U.S. is not interested in that place, it sunk so many lives and so many billions of dollars in Afghanistan. If they're not interested there, are they really going to get involved in Ukraine to any degree? You could see why Putin could put that into his calculus. Now, you could argue that he was going to invade all the time because he doesn't recognize Ukraine as an independent state and has long wanted to rebuild the Soviet Union. But it's hard also to imagine that those weren't factors in his calculus, and that's why there's so much talk today about what China reads from the world's reaction to Ukraine. How much is the West willing to arm Ukraine, and for how long? Seems like Western unity is flagging right now, certainly with the delays in U.S. assistance. How long does NATO stay together on this, and what can China learn about how the world would then react to its invasion of Taiwan? So these things they're connected for sure, and they're reading the signals. And I think deterrence is exactly the point. Deterrence requires strength. It requires credibility. It requires a belief that, for instance, NATO would abide by Article 5. If I'm Putin and I look at a Trump presidency based purely on what he said in public, I would begin to doubt that, depending on how the election comes out in November. So, it's great that you point out that there's history to this. It didn't begin in 1939. Hitler was around for a few years and he was rattling his saber long before that moment, while a lot of Americans were saying, well, maybe we could work with this guy. Doesn't sound that dissimilar from the way folks talk about Putin.
So last two questions here. So number one, I'm curious, and this is really why I think the World War metaphor is really helpful, because there are just so many theaters involved. It's not just that we are sitting in Eastern Europe backstopping the Ukrainians. There could be a conflict over Taiwan. You're going to see a Hamas attack, launch a war over Gaza that's going to deeply involve the American foreign policy for a variety of complicated reasons. This just can't be just thought of as just like one specific theater that we handle once at a time, in the way that Iraq was one at a time in terms of Desert Storm, or that Vietnam could be thought of as this thing, or that Korea was this specific thing. So what is your advice for Americans who are having to find themselves thinking about just this real scope and not having them basically just respond? And this is kind of like the Bridge-Colby argument. Wow, like we really can't do everything at once. We need to really focus on specific areas, because it seems like the real consensus is we have to do everything at once to our maximum possible ability. That's where the interesting part of this debate is. So how do you think about that aspect?
I mean, I think we do still have to prioritize, but the part of my argument in the book is that these events are connected, right? That Ukraine is connected to Taiwan, and what we saw in Ukraine in 2014 is connected to 2022, and that Transnistria, this distant place that's sort of funny to pronounce, is connected as well, and that the cyber attacks by Russia and China on the U.S. and its allies are connected, and that Russia sending a S-300 missile system to Hezbollah in the midst of the Israel-Gaza war is connected, because Russia wants to disrupt and occupy the U.S. and its allies, and that Iran and North Korea supplying weapons to Russia for its war in Ukraine is connected, and they want something in return, missile technology and nuclear technology, that these things are not isolated, that they are part of this new great power conflict, and that all those players, they don't want anything good for us. Whatever Trump says, and I could work with them. No, they've made strategic decisions to undermine the U.S. because they see that as in their interests, and that we as Americans have to see those connections and respond in a connected way. It doesn't mean we go to war over every front. We're just not capable of that, and we don't want it, right? And arguably, I mean, the Russians and Chinese don't want direct conflict with the U.S. I've been told repeatedly, but there are red lines. We have to communicate those red lines, and sometimes it is worth fighting. I always think we talk about World War II. We still have a movie every year about World War II and how America stood up and, fought back against the Holocaust and fought back against Hitler and imperialist Japan. Every year there's another one where we congratulate ourselves. We're being tested today. We can't keep hearkening back to 80 years ago and patting ourselves on the back when some of those same challenges exist today. That's the test.
So here's the last question that I found myself thinking about in the beginning of your book. So this is obviously a book of reporting. You have recommendations, but you're really writing this as, the chief, foreign affairs analyst at CNN. I know that's not your exact title, but work with me here. If we're thinking about the press and national security, an interesting reality between World War II and today is that I was obviously in a pre-Watergate, pre-Vietnam War era of American society, where at a societal trust perspective, and frankly, just at a norms perspective, members of the press were very, very confident around the idea that their job was to advance victory. Their job is to, in some ways, act as a stenographer for the, U.S. government. And you were talking about at the start of your book of how, like, when you were talking about all the U.S. intelligence that was predicting a war in Ukraine, like some of your colleagues were like, hey, like, careful there, Jim. Like, you don't want to just be a stenographer. You don't want to, because in many ways, if we're looking at where did the press fail in Vietnam, it's like that early press was just, once again, applying that World War II level. Okay, like General Westmoreland's telling us things are great. We've got a victory plan. So I'm just telling that story. So there's an obvious like worst case scenario there, but how do you just think of, and once again, we're talking about World War level situations where the stakes are that high, quasi total war. How do you think about how the press acts in a scenario like that?
Well, some pushback for a moment, because I've never felt and don't think I've operated like a stenographer, right? I mean, when I was reporting U.S. intelligence assessments about Russian military buildup and intentions to invade Ukraine, that was based not just on my understanding of what the intelligence showed, but also I've been going there for years, right? Writing books about Putin's intentions, what he said publicly, what his vision is of Europe. So I think all of us have to do more than just pick up the phone and say, "Oh, is that what you're saying?" Mr. Intelligence Source. We all have to, connect our dots and put context in it. I agree that, we're in a different time now. There's not going to be a Walter Cronkite moment with the Vietnam War, right? Where the most trusted newsman in America said, in effect says, it looks like we're losing this war. And the majority of Americans say, well, if he says it, I believe it, because our news environment has been so atomized now, and folks in their bubbles, right? And beyond that, there's just a decline of confidence in institutions across the board. People don't trust Congress or the White House or the Supreme Court or the intelligence industry or the FBI, which is problematic, right? Because it's, could you marshal this country to an effort like we saw in World War II against a global actor like Hitler with genuine sacrifice of lives and blood and, rationing and all that kind of stuff? It's hard to see who would be that leader that could rally the troops, in this highly partisan environment with information bubbles. I don't know. Maybe it's not possible. I mean, I have seen instances where you break through that bubble. I saw that in the early stages of the Ukraine war when there was a groundswell of support here. I saw it in the wake of October 7th, right, where there was a groundswell that this shall not stand. But it's a heck of a lot harder. It's a great point.
I think that's the perfect place to close, just because once again, this is why I'm personally just obsessed with the 30s period, because once again, the questions are there. We kind of tell the Arsenal of Democracy story as if it started on December 7th, 1941, but actually like we started rearming and preparing for mobilization, not just like in 1939, but in many ways, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, early New Deal response, like literally served as a training ground for the World War II era army. Like, George C. Marshall led the CCC. Like that's a really interesting thing. But appeasers and isolationists like actively attempted to undermine that pre-period by using societal distrust against weapons makers during that World War I period to say, let's not, convert factories. Let's not prepare for weapons orders. Let's not go to those 50,000 planes, because we saw what those distrustful people did last time. So I think that what people in our space have to do is we're talking to this really sort of disassociated country right now is understand that our job is not to be stenographers, is to be skeptical. But I think it's very easy to lean into the distrust narrative in a way that's dangerous. Very, very, very active when we see those examples. So, Jim, this has been really great. Thank you so much for joining me.
I truly enjoyed the conversation. I love diving into history. So I hope we can keep it up.